It was 7:42 a.m. on a quiet suburban street in southern Georgia when the first 911 call came in. A neighbor, trembling and barely able to form words, reported hearing a child scream. Sharp, brief, and then nothing. Within minutes, patrol cars lined Willow Creek Drive, their flashing lights painting the walls of identical beige houses in red and blue. Officers moved in cautiously, unsure of what they were about to find. The front door of the small brick house at 1128 was slightly ajar, the morning breeze pushing it open just enough to reveal chaos inside. The smell hit first, metallic, raw, unmistakable. Blood. It was smeared across the entryway tiles, streaked along the wall as if someone had tried to steady themselves. In the living room, toys lay scattered, a stuffed bear face down, a coloring book half filled with bright yellow suns and crooked blue skies. A television murmured softly in the background, still tuned to a children's cartoon channel. Detective Laura Miles, a 15-year veteran of the department, was among the first to enter. Her boots left wet prints on the tiled floor as she stepped carefully, flashlight beam cutting through the dim hallway. The air felt thick, heavy with silence, except for the hum of the ceiling fan still turning lazily above. When she reached the first bedroom, she froze. Two small beds stood side by side, sheets crumpled and stained deep crimson. Tiny forms lay still beneath them. Laura whispered something under her breath, a prayer, a plea, but her voice cracked midway. In the next room, she found another child, slumped against the wall, as if trying to hide. And in the bathroom, a fourth, a little girl, no older than 4, curled beside the bathtub. The scene was unspeakable. The house, once filled with laughter, had become a monument to violence. The suspect was nowhere to be found. The kitchen window had been shattered from the inside, suggesting someone had fled, but there were no footprints outside, only the faint sound of distant sirens growing louder. Then, through the haze of shock, an officer called out from the backyard. Behind a line of bushes, half concealed in the dew-covered grass, lay a woman in a blood-soaked nightgown. Her hands were trembling, her face pale as chalk, her eyes vacant and wide. "She's still alive," the officer said, kneeling beside her. But what he saw next would haunt him for years. Clutched in her hand was a kitchen knife, the same brand as those missing from the block on the counter inside. She looked up at the officers, tears mixing with rain and sweat. "I didn't mean to," she whispered. They wouldn't stop crying. The woman's name was Angela Porter, 32 years old, mother of 4, recently separated from her husband. To the outside world, she was quiet, polite, a woman trying to rebuild her life after a messy divorce. But inside that small home, behind drawn curtains, something had been unraveling for weeks. Neighbors would later recall hearing arguments late at night, a woman sobbing, and sometimes the faint sound of children calling out. Yet, in a community where everyone minded their own business, no one thought to intervene. Now, standing outside with their coffee mugs and phones in hand, they watched in disbelief as Angela was handcuffed and led to the waiting patrol car. Her face was expressionless, her voice calm, almost eerily so. "They're sleeping now," she murmured, as if trying to convince herself it was true. As crime scene technicians entered, the horror deepened. Every room told a story of chaos and despair. A toppled family photo frame lay shattered on the floor, its glass fractured right across a smiling picture of Angela with her 4 children at the local park. Investigators found signs of a struggle: broken toys, a spilled cup of milk, footprints leading from one room to another. The timeline was brutal yet precise. Sometime before dawn, Angela had reportedly woken up, gone to the kitchen, and taken a knife from the drawer. What followed was a sequence of events no one could fully comprehend. Each act carried out in moments of rage or delusion, followed by silence. The neighbors hadn't heard much, just that one scream. When the coroner's van finally pulled up, the street was blocked off with yellow tape. Reporters had begun to gather, whispering theories, setting up cameras. Someone mentioned postpartum depression. Another spoke of a custody battle gone wrong. But no one truly knew. Not yet. As Angela sat in the back of the patrol car, her hands shaking beneath the metallic glint of handcuffs, she kept repeating a single phrase, "I just wanted peace." Her words would become the cornerstone of her defense, echoing through courtrooms and headlines for months to come. That morning, as the sun climbed higher and the children's bodies were carried from the home, the silence of Willow Creek broke. Mothers clutched their kids tighter. Fathers stood in their driveways, staring blankly at the house that had become a scene of horror. and Detective Laura Miles, standing on the porch with blood on her boots and tears in her eyes, whispered to herself, "This isn't just a crime scene. This is a tragedy that started long before today." The police station that morning was unnaturally still. Outside, rain tapped against the windows in a slow rhythmic pattern as if echoing the heaviness inside. Detective Laura Miles sat across from Angela Porter in a small gray interrogation room, her notebook open but untouched. Angela's wrists were cuffed lightly to the table, her knuckles pale from the cold metal. Her nightgown, now replaced with a faded orange jumpsuit, still carried faint stains that no one dared to comment on. Her eyes stared straight ahead, unfocused, hollow, as though she were watching a movie only she could see. "Angela," Laura said softly, sliding a bottle of water across the table, "we need to talk about what happened this morning." There was a long pause before Angela spoke, her voice hoarse. "They wouldn't stop crying. I told them I couldn't take it anymore. But they didn't listen." To a stranger, her tone might have sounded detached, even cruel. But to Laura, it was something else. Something broken. Years of experience had taught her that evil didn't always look like a monster. Sometimes, it looked like a mother who had reached a point of no return. The room filled with the quiet hum of the overhead light as Laura gently pressed for more. Piece by piece, Angela began to describe a spiral that had started months before the murders. The custody battle with her ex-husband, the loss of her job, the eviction notice that had come just 2 weeks earlier. "I kept thinking if I could just hold on," Angela whispered. "But the voices, they told me it would be better if we all went together." Across the hall, the forensic team was piecing together the evidence from the scene. Every item was photographed, labeled, and logged. The knife, the blood-stained bedding, the small handprints on the wall. The medical examiner's preliminary report confirmed what everyone already feared. Each child had died from multiple stab wounds, all inflicted in a short window of time. There were no signs of defensive injuries on Angela herself, no evidence of an outside intruder. The case, at least in the physical sense, was clear. But the why remained a mystery that would consume investigators and psychologists alike. Detective Miles left the interrogation room and joined her partner, Sergeant Daniel Ruiz, in the observation area. He rubbed his eyes, exhaustion and disbelief etched into his face. "You ever seen anything like this?" he asked quietly. Laura shook her head. "Not like this. Not from a mother." Ruiz exhaled sharply. "She's calm. Too calm. Like she thinks she did something merciful." Laura glanced back through the glass at Angela, who sat motionless, eyes fixed on the wall. Maybe in her mind she did. Outside the station, the story had already exploded across social media. News trucks crowded the street, reporters shouting over one another, headlines flashing. "Mother arrested in stabbing deaths of 4 children." Photos of Angela from her happier days flooded the internet. Birthday parties, park picnics, smiling faces now hauntingly juxtaposed against the mugshot that followed. The public reaction was immediate and divided. Some called her a monster. Others, after learning about her mental health struggles, saw a victim of a system that had failed her. Back inside, detectives dug deeper into her background. Angela had filed for divorce 6 months earlier after years of reported emotional abuse. She'd been diagnosed with severe postpartum depression after her youngest child's birth, but records showed she had stopped taking her medication 3 months ago. Child Protective Services had visited the home once after a neighbor complained of screaming and strange noises, but the case had been closed after a brief welfare check. No one thought she was capable of violence. Until now. By noon, the department's evidence board was covered in photos, timelines, and documents. Red string connected moments of her life like fragile threads. Her layoff notice from the diner, medical prescriptions, a court custody order. Everything pointed to a woman unraveling in silence. "She didn't wake up one day and decide to kill her kids," Laura said during the briefing. "This was a collapse, slow, invisible, and ignored." That night, while the city slept, detectives stayed late reviewing footage from nearby surveillance cameras. At 3:16 a.m., a blurry figure, later confirmed to be Angela, was seen pacing outside her house, clutching something in her hand. She appeared to be talking to herself. At 3:45, the lights inside the home went out. By dawn, the tragedy was complete. The timeline was chillingly short. As the clock passed midnight in the precinct, Laura stared at the crime photos once more. 4 small faces smiled back at her from a school portrait taken just weeks earlier. The youngest, Emily, had been wearing a paper crown, her grin wide and proud. Laura closed the file slowly. "This isn't about evil," she said quietly to Ruiz. "It's about breaking, and no one noticing until it's too late." In the silence that followed, the hum of the fluorescent lights seemed almost deafening. Outside, the rain had stopped. The world was quiet again. But for those inside that station, the echoes of that morning, the cries, the confusion, the unbearable stillness, would never truly fade. By mid-morning, Willow Creek Drive had transformed into a scene of quiet chaos. Yellow police tape crisscrossed the sidewalks, neighbors stood in clusters, and the hum of news vans filled the air. The tragedy had already reached the local community and national media. Reporters jostled for positions, cameras trained on the house where 4 lives had ended abruptly. Inside, the father of the children, Mark Porter, arrived. His face, pale and drawn, carried the raw weight of disbelief and anguish. He had been notified by the authorities after an anxious neighbor had finally called him. He stepped from his car, hands trembling, and for a moment simply stared at the front door, as though willing it to open and return the children he had kissed goodnight the night before. There were no words at first, only the ragged sound of his own breath breaking the silence. Mark had been divorced from Angela for 6 months, their marriage ending after years of tension and financial strain. Friends described him as a gentle, protective father, someone who had fought for custody and stability, only to be confronted now with an incomprehensible nightmare. When officers approached, he barely registered their words, his mind caught in a loop between disbelief and dread. "I just don't. I can't," he muttered, voice cracking. The detectives guided him gently into the living room, now cleared of bodies but still thick with the presence of tragedy. Personal items remained untouched, the children's school projects, their shoes, the books lined up on shelves, all silent reminders of lives interrupted. Outside the house, neighbors reacted in disbelief and horror. Some could not comprehend how a mother could commit such acts. Others felt guilt for not intervening sooner, for not noticing the signs of a woman struggling under unbearable pressure. Community leaders called emergency meetings, social workers stepped in, and local schools held counseling sessions. Everyone knew this was a tragedy that would leave a permanent mark, not only on Mark Porter and his family, but on the collective memory of the town. The grief was palpable. Small memorials began forming, flowers, stuffed animals, handwritten notes with messages like, "Rest in peace, little ones," and "Gone too soon." Meanwhile, Angela remained in custody, silent for most of the day. Her expression alternated between tears and a detached emptiness that frightened those who watched her. At one point, she asked for a blanket and sat quietly in the corner, rocking slightly, as if the world around her had stopped functioning. Psychologists later noted that her demeanor suggested extreme dissociation, a protective response to overwhelming guilt, depression, and emotional trauma. While investigators pieced together the timeline of events, they also began collecting the medical records, therapy notes, and witness accounts that would help explain the deeper patterns that had led to this tragedy. Mark, however, could not look away from the house. He wandered the perimeter, speaking softly to the investigators, recounting memories of his children. Birthdays, first days of school, evenings spent reading stories together. The pain in his voice was raw, unfiltered, a mix of anger, confusion, and unbearable loss. Friends tried to comfort him, but even their presence seemed to heighten the reality of the situation. Nothing could erase what had happened, and nothing could bring his children back. His grief became a public symbol of the human cost of this crime, capturing the attention of news outlets and social media alike. The media frenzy intensified as reporters obtained statements from neighbors, friends, and school officials. Headlines ranged from shock to outrage, and social media users debated the causes. Mental illness, lack of social support, and the warning signs of domestic instability. Psychologists appeared on news programs explaining postpartum depression, dissociative episodes, and the need for early intervention, all while Mark Porter sat silently, listening to strangers theorize about his family's worst day. The contrast was stark, a father mourning in real time, the world theorizing from behind screens. Later that afternoon, detectives conducted a preliminary reconstruction of the events inside the house. Without going into graphic detail, they noted patterns suggesting rapid escalation, brief moments of clarity, and the possibility that Angela believed her actions would end the suffering for everyone. Officers documented every corner, every object, and every sign that might provide insight into the mother's state of mind. The psychological profile emerging was complex. A mix of untreated mental illness, life stressors, and an overwhelming sense of hopelessness. Each discovery added layers to the case, but none offered solace to Mark Porter or the grieving community. By evening, a press conference was held outside the police station. Detectives and community leaders spoke in somber tones, emphasizing the rarity of such cases and the need for awareness of mental health crises. Mark Porter did not speak publicly, but a single photograph captured him standing behind the podium, head bowed, shoulders trembling under the weight of unimaginable sorrow. Across the nation, people paused to reflect on the fragility of life, the responsibilities of parenting, and the signs that often go unnoticed until it's too late. As night fell over Willow Creek, the memorials outside the house glowed faintly in candlelight. Small crowds of neighbors and strangers lingered quietly, some kneeling to leave flowers, some simply standing in reflective silence. Detective Laura Miles returned home exhausted, haunted by the faces she had seen that day: Angela's vacant stare, Mark's broken grief, and the innocent smiles of the children now gone. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. A car door slammed. Life went on outside, indifferent to the tragedy contained within the walls of that small house. But for Willow Creek, and for the Porters, nothing would ever feel normal again. Months passed, and the quiet town of Willow Creek remained haunted by that early morning in April. The trial of Angela Porter became the centerpiece of national media coverage, a grim spectacle that blended grief, outrage, and an uneasy fascination. Courtroom doors opened early each morning to accommodate reporters, legal teams, and the public, all drawn by the shocking nature of the crime. Cameras were barred from filming, but sketches of Angela at the defense table showed a woman who alternated between silent introspection and bursts of emotion, her eyes occasionally darting to her attorney for reassurance. Across from her, prosecutors stood rigid, prepared to detail the events of that morning and argue for a sentence reflecting the weight of her actions. The trial began with a reading of charges, a litany so severe that the air seemed to thicken in the courtroom. 4 counts of first-degree murder. Aggravated assault. The weight of each word landed like a hammer. Angela's defense team focused not on denying her actions, they could not, but on explaining her mental state. Severe postpartum depression, untreated psychiatric disorders, and dissociative episodes that had escalated to a catastrophic breaking point. Psychiatric experts were called to testify, their calm voices explaining how extreme stress, isolation, and untreated mental illness could distort perception, judgment, and maternal instinct. The courtroom listened, riveted, torn between empathy and horror. Outside, the public debate raged across social media platforms, talk shows, and opinion columns. Headlines oscillated between condemnation, mother becomes monster, for children dead, and cautious analysis, a system that failed her, understanding postpartum psychosis. Neighbors who had once waved to Angela at the mailbox now whispered behind closed doors, grappling with the unsettling truth that the person they had known could commit such acts. Candlelit memorials remained in place, a somber reminder that the victim's absence continued to echo through every corner of the town. For Mark Porter, the courtroom was unbearable. Sitting in the front row, he stared at Angela, the mother of his children, now a stranger bound by law and tragedy. His hands clenched the edge of the bench. His jaw tightened as he tried to maintain composure. Every testimony, every photo, every word spoken in the courtroom seemed like a fresh wound. The prosecution's strategy focused on the sequence of events, the methodical nature of the acts, the premeditation implied by the weapon selection, and Angela's actions following the deaths. While the defense argued her intent was distorted by mental illness, the prosecution painted a picture of cold calculation, a mother who had chosen a final, irreversible act rather than seeking help. Emotional testimony from neighbors, teachers, and family friends filled the room. Each account of Angela's increasing isolation, her verbal expressions of hopelessness, and the moments leading up to the tragedy contributed to a mosaic of explanation and condemnation. Journalists from around the country covered every development. Early morning news segments offered recaps, while cable networks ran panel discussions featuring psychologists, legal analysts, and child welfare experts. Viewers debated the influence of mental illness versus accountability, the adequacy of social services, and the warning signs that had gone unnoticed. Some framed the case as a cautionary tale about the pressures of modern parenting and the stigma surrounding maternal mental health. Others, unrelenting in their anger, called for the harshest possible sentence, arguing that no diagnosis could justify the loss of 4 young lives. The media attention intensified the pressure on the jury, who would spend weeks balancing empathy with the demands of justice. During one particularly tense day of testimony, a forensic psychologist described Angela's mental state at the time of the crime. Her speech, her recorded statements, and the behavioral patterns all suggested dissociation, a condition in which the mind disconnects from reality under extreme stress. This is not a case of malice in the traditional sense, the expert explained. It is a tragic convergence of untreated mental illness, overwhelming life stress, and acute emotional collapse. Some jurors nodded, visibly shaken by the explanation, while others glanced at photos of the victims, the innocence of their faces unaltered by the brutality of their deaths. The courtroom was a study in contrasts: reason versus emotion, law versus grief, understanding versus outrage. Mark Porter's testimony was brief but searing. He spoke of love, daily routines, and the irreplaceable moments he had shared with his children. "They were my world," he said, voice breaking. "And now they're gone. I can't fix this. I can't explain it. I don't understand how the person who brought them into this world could take them from it." The courtroom fell silent. Cameras zoomed in on Angela, who remained still, head bowed, tears streaming, absorbing each word in quiet horror. No argument, no legal explanation could undo the damage or the grief, and everyone present felt the weight of that reality. Public outrage reached a crescendo when the jury began deliberations. Social media posts, opinion columns, and online forums lit up with theories, emotions, and debates. Some argued for life imprisonment. Others called for mental health treatment and rehabilitation. The duality of judgment, both moral and legal, permeated every conversation. In Willow Creek, neighbors walked silently past the memorials, uncertain if words could ever capture the depth of the loss or the complicated humanity of the woman behind the crime. As night fell over the courthouse, lights in the jury room glowed faintly, signaling that deliberation was underway. Outside, protesters held candles and signs, some demanding justice, others demanding awareness of mental health crises. The media waited, the public speculated, and the story continued to grow beyond the walls of the courtroom. Detective Laura Miles watched from a distance, knowing that justice would be measured not only in legal terms but in the societal understanding of how tragedy, isolation, and mental illness intersect in the most devastating ways. The courtroom was packed on the morning of the verdict, the air electric with tension, grief, and anticipation. Reporters jostled for positions near the doors, their cameras pointed toward the small wooden box where the jury would soon deliver their decision. Friends and family of both Angela Porter and Mark Porter had gathered, their faces taut with emotion, as if every heartbeat carried the weight of what was about to be announced. Inside, Angela sat motionless, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, eyes fixed on the floor. She had grown thinner over the months of pre-trial detention, her hair pulled back in a tight bun, and her expression unreadable. The courtroom seemed to shrink around her, the gravity of the moment pressing down like a physical weight. The judge entered, robes sweeping the floor, and the room fell into near silence. He reminded everyone that the decision about to be delivered would determine the outcome of a case that had shocked the nation. The jury, composed of 12 citizens from various walks of life, filed in, faces solemn, carrying the tension and deliberation of days spent dissecting every piece of testimony, every psychological report, every statement from the witnesses. Each juror had wrestled privately with the complexity of the case, balancing empathy for a mother struggling with mental illness against the irrevocable loss suffered by 4 innocent children. When the 4 persons stood to read the verdict, the courtroom collectively held its breath. "We, the jury, find the defendant, Angela Porter, guilty of 4 counts of first-degree murder," the voice rang out, steady yet grave. A shiver passed through the room as if the words themselves carried a physical weight. Angela's eyes finally lifted, meeting the jury foreperson's gaze, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of recognition, perhaps comprehension, perhaps remorse. She did not cry. She did not speak. Her hands tightened around the edge of the chair. Mark Porter slumped forward, resting his head in his hands, silent tears tracing lines down his face. Friends and family members reached for one another, the sound of quiet sobbing echoing off the high walls. The sentencing portion of the trial followed swiftly. The prosecution recommended life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, citing the premeditated nature of the acts and the irrevocable harm inflicted. The defense attempted to argue for a sentence that would allow Angela access to mental health treatment, emphasizing that her mental state had been severely compromised and that she was a product of circumstances and untreated illness. The judge, after reviewing the evidence, the expert testimonies, and the jury's deliberation, imposed a life sentence without the possibility of parole. His words were deliberate, measured, acknowledging both the tragedy of the children's deaths and the complex factors that had contributed to Angela's actions. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was immediate and polarized. News outlets captured the grief, relief, and anger pouring from members of the public. Some applauded the sentence as justice for the children. Others lamented the inability of mental health systems to intervene before tragedy struck. Social media became a whirlwind of debate, memorials, and reflections on the systemic failures that might have prevented the event. Many wrote of the fragile balance of parental responsibility, societal oversight, and mental health awareness. Candlelight vigils formed spontaneously, with neighbors leaving flowers, drawings, and notes outside the courthouse and at the site of the tragedy. Each gesture was a silent acknowledgement of both the loss and the collective failure that had preceded it. Mark Porter emerged from the courthouse later that day, flanked by close family and friends. He refused to speak to reporters, instead choosing to walk slowly to his car, his eyes red and distant. He stopped briefly at the memorial outside the house, kneeling beside the flowers, the notes, and the small toys left in memory of his children. His fingers traced the names of each child on a handmade card, whispering each one aloud, his voice trembling but steady. "I'll carry you with me," he said, barely audible. "Always." The crowd that had gathered gave him space, a shared recognition of his grief and of the unhealable wound that the morning of April 4th had created. Angela was transported back to the correctional facility immediately after sentencing. She walked with a quiet, subdued gait, flanked by officers, her expression empty yet internally fraught. She was escorted to her cell, where she would begin the life sentence that had been imposed. Psychologists later observed her behavior in custody as deeply introspective, often silent for hours, sometimes speaking to herself in fragments, perhaps trying to reconcile her actions, perhaps simply existing in a mental fog created by trauma, guilt, and remorse. In the town of Willow Creek, life moved forward, but the shadow of that morning never lifted. Parents watched their children with renewed vigilance, neighbors whispered about warning signs they had overlooked, and the memorial outside the house remained, a solemn and constant reminder of the fragility of life and the depth of human tragedy. Detective Laura Miles, who had been on the scene from the very beginning, reflected on the case in her private journal. Justice was served in the eyes of the law, but the grief will never end. And perhaps that is the truth all of us must carry with us, the reminder that some tragedies cannot be undone. The trial, verdict, and sentencing became a case study for psychologists, social workers, and law enforcement agencies alike. It highlighted the complexities of maternal mental health, the subtle signs of a psychological breakdown, and the importance of intervention before a crisis reaches an irreversible stage. The story of Angela Porter and her 4 children became more than a local tragedy. It became a cautionary tale, one discussed in classrooms, police training, and public forums, a story intended to ensure that future suffering might be prevented even if the wounds of Willow Creek would never fully heal. Angela Porter's arrival at the correctional facility marked the beginning of a life confined by concrete walls, iron bars, and the endless echo of her own thoughts. The prison, a sprawling complex with gray stone facades and razor-wire fences, seemed almost designed to strip away individuality, and yet it could not erase the human mind that now occupied it. From her first moments in custody, Angela was subjected to a regimented routine. Meals at set times, roll calls, limited recreation, and constant surveillance. Officers described her as quiet, reserved, and compliant, often keeping to herself and avoiding the communal areas where other inmates congregated. Yet, beneath that surface calm, prison psychologists and counselors noted the constant mental struggle she faced. During her initial psychological evaluations, Angela displayed signs of extreme remorse and reflection. She spoke sparingly at first, often pausing to gather her thoughts before answering even the simplest questions. "I don't expect forgiveness," she admitted in one session, her voice barely above a whisper. I want to understand why it happened. I need to live with it, I guess, because I can't change it." Her counselors noted that she exhibited traits of post-traumatic stress, depression, and dissociation, a complex combination that had likely intensified the day of the tragedy. Over time, Angela's sessions focused not only on managing her mental health but also on exploring the root causes of her actions, from untreated postpartum depression to escalating isolation and stress that had gone unnoticed by the world around her. Life inside the prison walls was both monotonous and grueling, a constant reminder of the consequences of her actions. Angela's days were filled with repetitive routines, chores, limited social interactions, and educational programs. But there were moments when memories of her children would pierce through the monotony.